Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Chapter 2, Race, Immigration, and Citizenship from the 1840s to the 1920s. The learning goals for this chapter are how did scientific racism evolve over the 20th century? How does scientific racism influence immigration and citizenship policies? How did legal decisions shape racial categories? Where did European immigrants fit into the racial hierarchy in the United States? What forms of violence did Native Americans confront in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? The reading talked about the continuation of scientific racism, which we began discussing last time. In the 19th century, we see craniometry, the measure of cranial capacity, which helps scientists present ideas of human hierarchy, again, using the different sizes of your brain to justify or to try to explain why certain populations were inferior and others were considered superior or more intelligent, and so on. Craniometry eventually lost its appeal, and scientists turned to new methods. But it is important to note that these pseudoscientific methods set out to prove white superiority. They were based on faulty procedures and should not be considered true science. As craniometry became less appealing, intelligence testing grew in popularity. In the United States, intelligence testing, the attempt to quantify intellectual ability using scientific measures, became popular in the early 20th century. Stephen Gould argues that the primary error in intelligence testing is that of reification, making intelligence into a scientific concept by measuring it. Contemporary scholars have pointed out that if there is no agreed upon measure of what intelligence is, it is not possible to conduct a serious study of whether or not there's a genetic basis for it. So in other words, they were arbitrarily deciding what were the variables you were going to measure to see if someone was more intelligent than someone else, right? Is it your capacity for remembering a lot of things? Is it your capacity to do certain math calculations? Is it knowing certain types of knowledge, right? And so because scientists can't agree which variable actually measures intelligence, then scientists believe and contemporary scholars believe that there is no reliable way of measuring intelligence, much less using those results to decide that a particular population is more intelligent than another. Nonetheless, there are still books and articles being written today that continue to uphold ideas of intelligence differences being a genetic marker of racial difference. And we saw a number of examples being discussed in the reading of more contemporary books. For example, the book in 2015, Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History, that continue to use intelligence testing as a way to explain racial differences. Eugenics refers to the practice of controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable characteristics in a population. This movement had its heyday from about 1900 to 1930 and led to sterilization programs targeting supposedly less intelligent people. Again, this was another way in which some of these intelligence studies were used. Eugenicists believe that not only intelligence, but also laziness, alcoholism, crime, poverty, and other traits could be inherited. Carl Pearson, for example, used correlation coefficients to evaluate the hereditary nature of these traits. These analyses, however, ignore environmental factors like nutrition and the quality of schooling that play a role in intelligence and, like genes, are shared among family members. But even though a lot of these studies were not very reliable, they nonetheless were used to justify and come up with immigration and citizenship policies. Madison Grant, the author of Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916, argued that the Nordics were superior to all other races due to their high intelligence. The idea of eugenics was also the basis for Hitler's eugenic sterilization law, which led to the sterilization of 225,000 people in Germany in just 3 years. So you can really see the danger of some of these policies. And we see how some of these ideas about race and intelligence and so on impacted the kinds of immigration laws that the government came up with in different time periods. One of the first laws passed in the newly formed United States was the Naturalization Law of 1790, which granted citizenship to whites born in the United States and limited naturalization to immigrants who were free white persons. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first major immigration legislation. It was overtly racist and targeted one specific group on the basis of race and class, Chinese laborers. The next major piece of immigration legislation was the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924, which was also overtly racist in that it was designed to increase the Nordic population of the United States and halt the growth made passports and visas a requirement for entry into the United States. It also established national origin quotas for European immigrants. So this act was meant to distinguish between Northern Europeans, which were considered Nordics, and Southern Europeans, like Italians, for example, who were coming at a large rate at that time, and that Anglo-Saxon whites did not see as white in the same way that they were. In 1943, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and in 1946, it extended the right of citizenship to other Asians. Quotas were revised in the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952, and then completely revamped in 1965. So you can see how for a very long time period, Asian immigration was being impacted by these ideas around race. Now, the exclusion laws that were created against the Chinese were a result from pressure from Anglo workers who saw Chinese laborers as, quote, diseased, sneaky, and dangerous competitors. The Immigration Act of 1917 expanded this Asian exclusion beyond just Chinese laborers and incorporated a number of other Asian populations, as the reading discussed. This legislation that as I mentioned earlier, was the first significant immigration legislation to be passed in the United States, led to the creation of border patrolling mechanisms, which today we would call the Border Patrol, and the creation of documentation for immigrants, such as green cards. So it was the exclusion of Chinese laborers first, and then this exclusion of other Asian populations that led to the need to create an entire immigration structure and bureaucracy. The reading also talks about birthright citizenship and when different populations were recognized for birthright citizenship. 1790, birthright citizenship was just for whites only. It wasn't until 1866, after the Civil War, that citizenship was granted to African Americans. While Native Americans had been here from the very beginning, it wasn't until 1924 that they were granted citizenship. Finally, in 1940, the Nationality Act extended birthright citizenship for all people born in the United States, regardless of race. The reading also talked about the role of the court system and how legal decisions shape racial categories. Between 1878 and 1952, US courts considered 51 cases in which a non-citizen contested his denial of citizenship on the basis of his race. And you saw in the reading sort of this contradiction, right, being discussed in the Osawa and then the cases around how to define what whiteness meant. So in the Takao Osawa versus US court case, the court determined that despite Japanese-born Osawa's white skin, he was not white because he was not Caucasian. In the Thin case, the court argued just months later that even though Asian Indians, such as Mr. Thin, were Caucasian in terms of where the region of the Caucasus, they were not white. So what then decides and who decides who is white, we can see is has been historically a bit arbitrary. In the Thin case, the courts defined whiteness based on what the common man understands Caucasian and whiteness to mean. They stated in their decision, what we now hold is that the words free white person are words of common speech to be interpreted in accordance of the common man, synonymous with the word Caucasian, only as that word is popularly understood. So in other words, the common man, and here the common man that is suggested is the common white man, what they think and understand and recognize as white is what white means, right? Which again makes that definition pretty subjective. And we see that in the history of how different populations that at first were not acceptable as white eventually become accepted as white. And they become accepted as white through these two different processes. The assimilation process, whereby immigrants lose their ethnic distinctiveness and become part of the mainstream, and the racialization process, whereby people come to be recognized as part of a racial group. The Irish first worked alongside Black people, but eventually replaced them in lower level wage work. The Irish formed unions to demand better wages and conditions and excluded Black people from these unions. And so this was one way in which the Irish eventually become white, by distinguishing themselves from Blacks. Italians who arrived in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s were legally white. At the same time, Italians were often juxtaposed to members of the Nordic race or Anglo-Saxons. It was only after the passage of legislation that cut off most immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that Italians came to be seen as only culturally, but not racially different from other whites. While Jewish people also encountered discrimination in the early 1900s, it wasn't until the aftermath of World War II in the 1940s, as Americans reckoned with the horrors of Nazism and subsequently denounced the eugenics movement, that anti-Semitism decreased somewhat in this country. And the image there is one of the many kinds of images that you would see in the late 1800s and early 1900s of how the Irish, for example, would be depicted, right, as animalistic, drunk, and so on. And nonetheless, over time, through these different assimilation and racialization processes, those stereotypes started to die down as they became incorporated and accepted into the white category. The reading also talked about structural violence as institutional harm or disadvantage inflicted on individuals or social groups. This harm is usually inflicted through government policies and practices. And some examples of structural violence include Native Americans confronting seizures of their lands and forced assimilation, and African Americans facing lynchings and consistent denial of their rights as citizens and as human beings. The structural violence against Native Americans by the US government can be seen through this process of different laws passed that further and further encroach on their land and diminish their rights. The 1851 Indian Appropriation Act created reservations for Native Americans and also provided funds for relocation for these communal lands, to these communal lands. The 1871 Indian Appropriation Act declared that the US government would no longer sign treaties with Native American tribes. So in other words, they no longer recognized Native American tribes as distinct nations. The 1887 Dawes Act forced Native Americans to give up their communal lands and to claim individual ownership of land plots. Because again, this was part of the assimilation process, right? Many Native communities were used to treating land as communal property, property that belonged to everyone in their community. And white Americans, particularly the US government, was trying to get them to assimilate to the American way of individual ownership, where everybody just had their small plot of land and that was the land that you owned and that you passed on to your family. Well, once they did that, right, once they take these big communal lands and cut them into individual lots, then that leaves a big chunk of land that's just available and therefore appropriated by the government to redistribute to white settlers. The 1934 Indian Reorganization Act ended previous allotment policies and facilitated tribal self-government, but to a certain degree. And a lot of this reorganization meant that there were requirements by the federal government to what kind of tribal governments were created and what they looked like. So still, even though these indigenous communities were allowed to create their own governments, they still had to fit a certain model created by the federal government for them. One of the other things also that starts happening as part of the assimilation process is requiring Indian children to be basically picked up and sent to boarding schools, where they were basically stripped of their indigenous culture, indigenous ways. Their hairs would be cut, their way of dress would be changed, they would be punished for not speaking English, and so on. Structural violence against African Americans, we see taking place through the period of Reconstruction and afterwards, where Reconstruction refers to the period from 1865 to 1877 in the United States, when the country attempted to reunite after the Civil War. During this time period, there was significant racial progress made, including the election of African Americans to Congress, the passage of the 14th Amendment, ensuring citizenship to any person born in the US, and the 15th Amendment, ensuring right to vote to everyone, regardless of race or color. Reconstruction, however, ended in 1877 when President Rutherford B. Hayes pulled federal troops from the southern United States, which were there to protect the rights of the newly freed African Americans. Once that protection isn't there anymore, then we see in the South the creation of laws that become known, Jim Crow laws, to create a segregation and the disenfranchisement of Black people. So there were suffrage amendments passed in the 1890s that prohibited or limited the vote for African Americans. For example, in Mississippi, legislators wrote a suffrage amendment that imposed a poll tax, excluded people who had been convicted of specific crimes, and required literacy tests for voting. And these were only requirements that were enforced or upheld for the Black community. Other states took similar measures, enacting grandfather clauses, poll taxes, and literacy requirements that led to the disenfranchisement of most Southern Blacks. Another method that was used to intimidate African Americans from pursuing their rights in the South after Reconstruction was the use of lynchings. Most victims of lynchings were African Americans in the South. From 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the US. with 3,446 of those being African Americans. So herein ends the lecture for this week. I will see you guys next time.